I hope you're all doing well. I am going to be talking to you today about later 20th century and contemporary literature, and I'm also going to be talking about Gwendolyn Brooks a bit. I'm trying to figure out how to, I don't know, I wasn't really able to figure out a way to make all this stuff, go together in a way that felt like a good lecture, but we're just going to do what we can here. So later 20th century and contemporary literature begins on page 553, and it takes on a huge chunk of time. So we are looking at World War II through now, and obviously a lot of things happened in the world in that time, and I think that's why it's hard to think of a super cohesive lecture about it, because it's a really long time. There's no one specific way you can define that whole time. So, alright, we got World War II in the 30s. Or World War II was not, it was not in the 30s, but World War II and the 30s. So 1929 we have the stock market crash. In the 30s we have the Dust Bowl, which is when people couldn't grow crops in the West and tried to go to California and couldn't. That's what The Grapes of Wrath is about, by John Steinbeck. There was also hyperinflation in Germany after World War I. And with all of these things going on, people were beginning to question the viability of capitalism itself. So there was a lot of economic and political discontent in Europe, which led to the rise of Hitler and the strengthening of Mussolini. So Hitler was, you know who Hitler is. Mussolini was the fascist who was in power in Italy. So all of these things were kind of, when we think about, I guess, the arc of modernity, people were continuing to feel as if the power structures that had existed beforehand, in the 1800s, the early 1900s, people were continuing to feel as if these power structures were no longer serving them effectively. So there was this continuing push away from older power structures and a push toward progress, and yet progress was sort of it was complicated. There was an upside to progress and a downside to progress. So an example of this would be that in World War II, super advanced military technology meant that this was the first war where innocent civilians were at risk of having bombs dropped on their cities from warplanes. So these assaults were really apocalyptic for people who were there, obviously. This is what the Blitz was in London. I really like this quote from the poet H.D. Hilda Doolittle that is mentioned in the book, where she called England an island of wounds during World War II. In many ways, World War II widened the gulf between soldiers and civilians, and thus widened the gulf between women and men. The citizens who suffered the most were the victims of the Holocaust, and also the victims of the American bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan, and Japanese Americans were also put into internment camps during the war. So one of the effects of technology was that it depersonalized the suffering that was inherent in any act of war, because people in the planes weren't super in touch with what was happening on the ground. After they dropped the bombs, they weren't witnessing the death and the suffering and the horror that those bombs caused for the people who were the victims. Okay. So let's see. So the United States, so World War II started in 1939. The U.S. entered in 1941 after Japanese planes bombed the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, as you are probably aware. And let's see. I've gone through most of this actually, I'm sorry. And one of the intellectual responses to the horrors of World War II was the philosophical movement called existentialism, which was led by Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus. And existentialism, according to the way the book defines it, this is on page 556, quote, posited a meaningless cosmos from which human beings could derive significance only through acts of engagement willed in and for themselves. And this was a really important philosophical movement that basically meant you have to make your own meaning in this world, right? Like there's no inherent meaning to human life. That is the responsibility of every single one of us to figure out for ourselves. So sort of terrifying, but also perhaps liberating as a philosophy goes. And if you kind of think back to modernism, this makes sense as like a progression of that, right? Like if we think about how much of modernist literature was just about like the destruction of like what people had believed in as societal, like what's the word? Like I guess like systems of authority. So like the church, the government, you know, people were kind of losing faith in these societal institutions is the word. And so with this loss of faith in institutions, we kind of see like this gradual progression toward a sense that we are actually like responsible for our own, like we're all there is, right? Like the individual has to figure it out for themselves, which is, you know, sort of dark. Okay, so the Cold War. All right, let me try and like effectively explain the Cold War. Not something I know super a lot about, but I did read the book, so we'll see here. So I guess the thing to really know about the Cold War is that it pushed like Western society toward a much more conservative way of looking at the world. So the Cold War began in 1945 at the Yalta Conference, where FDR gave Stalin parts of conquered Germany as spoils of war. And this is when Stalin divided Germany into East and West Germany. And this is what was like the Iron Curtain, as represented by the Berlin Wall, which was built in the middle of Berlin to keep people in East Berlin from escaping to West Berlin. So the Berlin Wall and like the Iron Curtain generally divided the Soviet Union and all of the nations near it who were under Soviet influence from Western Europe. And in the U.S., anti-communist sentiment grew and resulted in left-wing writers, directors, and actors being blacklisted, which was in Hollywood, they would be deprived of their careers and reputations by producers worried about political respectability. So that is an important term. If you were blacklisted, you were basically like censured out of being able to make your art because people thought that you were a communist. So it was a very dangerous time in the United States to be like, I guess, to have like left-wing ideology. This is also like the time of the McCarthy trials when Joseph McCarthy was like bringing like all kinds of people in for like hearings because he said they were communist sympathizers. That's what the Crucible is about. So it was like compared to the witch trials in Salem. So leftist intellectuals were across the board understandably worried about losing their careers because they got like pinned by McCarthy or because they got blacklisted, right? So like it was not a great time for leftist thought. The overarching culture of the United States in the 50s was one of social and political conservatism. So this was when we had the rise of the middle-class suburban culture in the United States, which was defined by conformity and materialism. This is on page 558. I really like the way they explain this in the book. Among the middle classes, an ideology of togetherness was dominant, as was an ethic of adjustment and maturity. Such television shows as I Love Lucy, Ozzie and Harriet, and Leave It to Beaver might celebrate the charmingly nutty antics of middle-class wives and children, but in the end, everyone professed to agree that, as the title of another series put it, father knows best. For those who do not acquiesce in such an idea, a new breed of professionals, psychiatrists, psychologists, advice columnists, and guidance counselors, arose to explain the virtues of normalcy. To be well-adjusted, they argued, was to fit into a system that was morally right and emotionally healthful. So, in contrast to kind of the some of the World War II era ideology of like losing faith in societal institutions, we kind of get this push back in the 50s where things get really conservative again and normalcy is like the ideal. It's good to be normal. And if you don't fit into the system, then there's something wrong with you, not with the system. That's like the sort of idea of the 50s. Another really important thing that I want to point out to you guys is also on page 558 is that the 50s saw the rise in literary criticism of what is called new criticism. So new criticism detached the literary text from its cultural context, meaning if you're a new critic, you think that you should be able to analyze a text based solely on what's like on the page there. So like new critics wouldn't be concerned with the social and political context in which a book was written. They wouldn't be concerned with the author's life. They basically would just use like what's on the page to make like critical assertions about what the text means. And the thing about new criticism is that it is essentially conservative, because if you are divorcing art from culture and society, you're basically taking the stance that like critics have to be politically neutral, and political neutrality at the time was probably like, I mean, as it is today, right? If you're like politically neutral, you're really just taking the side of the status quo. So there's no true political neutrality. You believe in the way things are, and then you don't. So new criticism grew out of T.S. Eliot's some of his like critical works, which you don't really need to know about, but it's something that you can still see today. Like the fact that you can walk into a standardized test in, you know, whatever, like take your ACT or your GRE or whatever, and they will give you like a passage of literature and expect you to analyze it without knowing any of the context. Like that is a relic of new criticism, which is this idea that like that's all you need to analyze a text. So that's important. All right. Where are we? Okay, so then we have our section titled, okay, so the 50s were super conservative, but there were also lots of thinkers who were not conservative, right? Like there were people who were saying this is not how society should be. And so, for example, you had the beat poets, you had confessional poets who wrote like specifically like their own life experiences using an I that was synonymous with the poet themselves. And we also had Southern Gothic writers in the United States, so people like Carson McCullers, Truman Capote, Tennessee Williams, Flannery O'Connor. They constructed, quote, grotesque fantasies to reveal the immaturity, maladjustment, and perversity endemic to apparently ordinary small-town communities. So if you've ever read Flannery O'Connor, she turns this idea of like conformity and normalizing and like adjusting to the status quo on its head by showing the ways in which like normalcy and conformity are really like harmful and are used to mask like what is actually a really like degenerate society. Okay, and then we have this section on page 559 titled The Third World, which people don't really say that anymore. I don't know why it's still called that in this book, but okay. So I would probably call this post-colonial nations, something like that. But this is an important section because it tells us about all of the countries that were being freed from British rule from the 1940s through the 1970s. And not just British rule, but also like French rule, just any colonial power. So this was the era where like colonialism was really disintegrating. The British Empire was falling, I guess would be the word for it. And intellectuals in these nations were left with this really complex cultural history, right? So if you grew up in a country like India, where on the one hand, like British people were in power your whole life, and on the other hand, India does have this really rich like cultural history of its own, you're then as a writer going to kind of have to negotiate the tension between those two things. So when we talk about post-colonial literature, it's literature by writers who are coming from nations that were formerly colonized by colonial powers. Catherine Mansfield is actually an example of this because she was from New Zealand. And if you think about in the Daughters of the Late Colonel, she is writing this story where she kind of draws a parallel between the colonel himself, who is this like patriarchal, kind of authoritarian seeming force for these young girls, right? Because like he can't, or they're not young anymore, but these women who their whole lives have been afraid to like go in his study, who feel that he's going to yell at them for going in his study, even though he's literally dead. And these women have never really thought about what they had to do with their own lives until their father passed away. I think that's kind of like meant to draw an analogy for us of what, the vast possibility and also like the difficulty for nations that were like losing their colonial oppressors, basically. And so that's why it takes place in India. There's definitely like a I guess an analogy, which I already said, but it's significant that it takes place in India, and that she is also writing from a post-colonial tradition in New Zealand, which was an English colony. Okay, and this was also happening not just in British and European colonies or former European colonies, but it was also happening in Latin America, where many writers were criticizing and challenging the colonial policies of the United States. Pablo Neruda listed here, Octavio Paz, Cesar Vallejo, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and we are also, like, post-colonial nations would also include, like, Canada, right? So Margaret Atwood is, you could consider her a post-colonial writer. And part of what's important about this, too, is that, especially for countries like New Zealand, Australia, Canada, that were, like, older British colonies, and even Canada, which, like, still is somehow ruled by the Queen. I don't know if that's true for the other two. I guess I should have looked that up, but not sure. But these nations were like forging their own literary traditions outside of a British literary tradition. And part of the reason they wrote in English was so that they would have like a wide audience around the world, because English had really globalized at this point. And so if you want to like reclaim your native country's culture, and if you want to like figure out what your literary tradition is, and you want to do that outside of British influence, ironically, you can do it in English, and then more people will read it, which is obviously problematic on its own, right? Because English is still the language of the oppressor. But yeah, okay. Then the 60s. Let's see. Let's talk about the 60s. Alright, so we had the 40s, we had the 50s, now we have the 60s. I told you this is too long of a section. Like, I just don't understand how they can have 9/11 and World War II in the same section. But okay. So the 60s, as we are all well aware, was very different from the 50s. So the 50s were conservative, the 60s were marked by social and political change and protest and revolution. So student movements led the groundwork for the anti-war movement, the Vietnam War. The militancy in the 60s was both political and social and involved a critique of Western culture more generally. The most influential movement, probably, of the 60s and of these sort of like liberatory movements happening in colonial nations around the world was the Black Civil Rights Movement in the United States, which led to lots of important literary developments. And so a general loosening of authoritarian hierarchies, as the book tells us here, was kind of marked the 60s. And women in the 60s had to confront not only their marginalization in regular society, right, which was like patriarchal and misogynistic, but they also had to confront the presence of those same forces of misogyny, like within the movements that claimed to be liberatory. And so this led to the women's liberation movement, which stressed, which was like their own, women started their own movement in the United States especially, which stressed sexual freedom, fostered the development of the LGBT rights movement, and involved gay men and lesbians who began to organize to combat the legal and moral strictures that had ostracized them in the past. This is on page 563. Okay, so let's see where I should move into. Alright, I want to talk about sorry about my neighbors. There's this section here called Future Shock, which is really just about like how when the Cold War ended and the 90s began, the future seemed sort of like really grim, but also and sort of impossible. So scientific advances seemed both deadly and life-giving. The AIDS epidemic had horrified the world, and there was still no cure. And then 9/11 happened in 2001, which I'm sure you're all aware of what 9/11 was. So 9/11 really like shocked the nation and shocked the world and led to this growth of a movement based on fear of international terrorism that was marked by a lot of Islamophobia, and which was basically used to justify the Iraq War, which, like, even though like no one who was involved in 9/11 was like Al-Qaeda wasn't in Iraq, and they didn't have weapons of mass destruction, which I think we all know that now, but at the time it was, there was a lot of support for this war because it made people feel like they were getting some kind of revenge on the terrorists who had attacked us in 9/11. And there was also a real rise of like conservative and neoconservative support for a surveillance-based government. So there was like a lot of phone tapping, and basically this idea that like fear was kind of coming to infringe on a lot of the freedoms that we took for granted as part of American life. Okay, so postmodern theorists during this time, 565, claimed that the, quote, grand narratives earlier used to explain historical change only camouflage the discontinuities and contradictions of reality. This is Derrida, who emphasized the indeterminacy of all systems of meaning. And I think this is a really like important concept because I think we tend to hope and believe that there are these kind of narratives that define like what happens historically, right? Like this war is like another war, or you know, there's these cycles to history. Just like we want to believe that there are some standardized narratives that we can expect in our personal lives, and these theorists were really saying like there are no narratives, right? Like nothing. There's no one grand like, you know, march toward progress or like anything like that. It's just that history is a bunch of discontinuous narratives, which is dark and like kind of depressing. Okay, contemporary images of women. This is probably the most important part of this section, and we're already at 26 minutes. I told you this is just, there's too much to, oh, there's so much. Okay. So contemporary images of women, I think this section is really important because they emphasize over and over again the way in which, in literature, women were reduced to a collection of body parts. So if you think back to Victorianism, women were meant to be pure and not enjoy sex. And when we move into like the 60s and, 60s, 70s onward, women were supposed to be sexy. So in a way, it was just completely reversed. Like women were now, if you weren't like somehow sexually available, or women who were represented as not sexual in whatever way, were not seen as virtuous, but rather as like frigid. So you really couldn't win. And I think this section is, okay. This section does a really good job of going through these examples of male-authored literature that just is so sexist and that really does like fragment the female body. And the problem with like fragmenting the female body, I think they say it well when on page 567, it leads to a fetishizing of body parts. Breasts, buttocks, and legs were often appraised separately as if the ideal woman could be put together like a jigsaw puzzle. And I think this still holds true today, right? Like you can still absolutely see like, oh, like the ideal woman has like, you know, like a big butt, but like a flat stomach and like large breasts or whatever. And like these are things that are like, and like long legs that are like thin, but not like weirdly thin. Like, you know, these are all things that are like very hard to have all of them at the same time, without, you know, plastic surgery. And this quote from Henry Miller's book, The Tropic of Capricorn, is so mean. I just want to, I guess, point it out. He describes, quote, the best fuck he ever had. The woman was, quote, a simpleton about whom he noted that above the belt she was batty. Perhaps that was what made her cunt so marvelously impersonal. It was one cunt out of a million. And so I think when you look at like these books from like the 40s, or really, I mean, that's from 1949, but really more like the 50s, 60s, even 70s, there's a lot of men who were writing very explicitly about sex in a way that had not necessarily like been done in a lot of literature before, but in writing about sex, which like, you know, reflected a sort of, I guess like loosening of social like morals or like literary morals. So with the loosening of those morals, I guess men felt more comfortable writing about sex, but in doing so, it became, like, these sexist attitudes became so much more vicious and clear, because it was no longer like, oh, this angel in the house who like comes and makes me dinner. It was, you know, this crazy woman whose cunt I like fucked, which, you know, is a little, it's mean, I think, is what it is. So, you know, at least our angel in the house was sort of a whole being, even if she was an inferior being. So for many of these men, the ideal woman was a fantasy figure. And, you know, perhaps they were very sexy, sensual figures, or perhaps they were being portrayed as the obnoxious, nagging mother, which is, Philip Roth did a lot of that. But no matter how these men portrayed women, it was very often that they were less than fully human. Which I think is a real problem in this literature, because I think like we still look at literature of like the 60s and 70s as being like pretty, you know, like revolutionary and like kind of like modern in its way and like, you know, cool. And yet these attitudes about women that were in a lot of this literature are like so toxic, and I think that they sometimes don't get as fully criticized or, you know, talked about as depictions of women in older literature. So on page 569, we are told that, quote, when women characters in mid-century literary texts were perceived as both real and good, they were often defined as good because they were willing to be sacrificed by men and for male purposes. So the best women were women who would sacrifice everything for a man, and many depictions of autonomous females, so women who like didn't, you know, tie their whole life to a guy. Those women were punished in these sort of revenge fantasies for their autonomy and for their desire to be on their own and not responsible to a man. And there's also, so at the bottom of page 569 and the top of 570, there's a lot of discussion of the way in which men would explicitly write these rape fantasies that were, as our authors say, comparably murderous. So Norman Mailer, Thomas Pynchon, even Eldridge Cleaver, and I think Amiri Baraka kind of used the female body as like a site of like working out other issues. So like we have here like Amiri Baraka and Eldridge Cleaver talking about how you should like rape white women because that was a way to get back at white men. So in this construction, the body of the white woman is a space for like racial, like, what am I trying to say, like, I guess, like, conflict and sort of, like, revenge, against an oppressive system. Like, the white female body becomes no longer, like, a human, but rather, like, a thing to get revenge on. So, obviously, like, racism is real, and yet these rape fantasies were kind of horrible. It seems that Eldridge Cleaver actually just admitted that he raped a white woman and felt like it was revenge. Yeah. So, Baraka wrote in 1965, rape the white girls, rape their fathers, cut the mothers' throats. And yeah, I actually really like Amiri Baraka. I didn't know he wrote that, but he did. So images of women, often disappointing. All right. And so we also have on page 571 this other idea of women, that women who wrote or were involved in poetry at all should be either a silent muse for a man to write about, or should be, quote, the muse in a complete sense, and should write with antique authority. So many men scornfully trivialized or melodramatically aggrandized the literary woman. So if you look at all these reviews that are quoted here on 571, male critics were often incredibly condescending in their reviews of work by women, even as they were ostensibly giving them a good review. Okay. So I am just not going to do contemporary women's lives yet because we're already at 36 minutes, and I want to talk about Gwendolyn Brooks a little bit. So turn to page 7. Her bio is on page 780, and the poems start on page 786. Okay. So Gwendolyn Brooks was born in Kansas, but she moved when she was very young to the south side of Chicago, which is where she lived most of the rest of her life, and where she is associated with as a poet. So her work is concerned with the everyday lives of Black Americans living in Chicago's south side. So she wrote these so it was about people who didn't have a lot of money, people who had been victims of systemic racism and redlining, and lived in these neighborhoods that were often very poor and dangerous. She explained early in her career that, quote, I wasn't writing consciously with the idea that blacks must address blacks. So meaning she did not think that her audience needed to specifically be other black people. But she changed her mind about that in 1967. A number of young black poets at the Second Black Writers Conference at Fisk University persuaded her that, quote, black poets should write as blacks about blacks and address themselves to blacks. So this is sort of a turning point in Gwendolyn Brooks's career and her understanding of her role as a poet, because she went from sort of representing, she always wrote about her experience as a black woman in America, but it was, I guess, really revolutionary for her to decide that black audiences were her primary audience. So she was no longer concerned with appealing to a white audience, and this is something that is still talked about with poetry today, right? Who is your audience as a poet? If you're writing poetry as a woman, but only women will read it, is that a problem? Somebody asked me that in my thesis defense 3 years ago, so definitely still a thing. Gwendolyn Brooks was also the first African American to win the Pulitzer Prize, which she got in 1950. Okay, so I want to talk about the rights for Cousin Vitt. That's probably all we're going to get through today. This was so long, I'm sorry, but it's been a while since we had a lecture, so here's a long one. Okay, the rights for Cousin Vitt, this is on page 786. Carried her unprotesting out the door. Kicked back the casket stand, but it can't hold her. That stuff and satin aiming to enfold her, the lid's contrition nor the bolts before. Oh, oh, too much, even now, surmise, she rises in the sunshine. There she goes, back to the bars she knew, and the repose in love rooms and the things in people's eyes. Too vital and too squeaking, must emerge. Even now she does the snake hips with a hiss, slops the bad wine across her shantung, talks of pregnancy, guitars, and bridge work, walks in parks or alleys, comes happily on the verge of happiness. Happily hysterics is. Okay. Um, I love this poem. So this is a sonnet. Um, it's sort of Petrarchan-ish, but she definitely is breaking the rules of the like traditional sonnet. It's not exactly like any kind of sonnet, and so that might be something to consider. Like, why would Gwendolyn Brooks have been interested in breaking out of some of the formal confines of the sonnet in a poem where she's writing about a woman who broke out of the confines of like society's idea of like a woman's place? So Cousin Vit. Vit could be short for Victoria, but it also is the first three letters of the word like vitality. So that is something critics say about the poems, like maybe, you know, it's short for that. So Cousin Vit is essentially so alive that she cannot be felled by death, and the coffin itself cannot hold her. She rises in the sunshine, and I saw this as kind of a biblical image, right? Because the other person we know of who rose is Jesus, and it's pretty like, you know, it's subversive for Brooks to be presenting this woman who we know, you know, drinks bad wine, talks of pregnancy, walks in parks or alleys, goes to bars and love rooms. It's very subversive for Brooks to be depicting this woman as sort of a potential Christ figure, like someone who could be resurrected because she is, I guess, like unkillable. And what else? So the other biblical image you'll see in this poem is in line 10, when she does the snake hips with a hiss. So we see her being somewhat compared to Eve, who we know is sort of our, you know, original sinner in the Bible, and the reason that all, you know, all women are immoral. And on the other hand, she's compared to Christ. And so I don't think this was unintentional on Brooks's part, right? Like, she's presenting us with this woman who's complicated and doesn't fall into any of these like archetypal depictions of women, and specifically black women, that would have been common at the time. And so I was like reading about this, and so some of the stereotypical depictions of black women at the time would have involved, okay, one of them is the mammy, which you may be familiar with this stereotype because it still exists in a lot of different things. Yeah, so the mammy is a black female who is overweight and ever intent on soothing individuals in an overly mothering way. Her happiness is contingent on serving others and offering them her emotional support. Another stereotype is the Jezebel, which is the hyper-sexualized woman who is constantly urging men into bed. Sort of a depiction of black women in particular as being like slutty and like sexually dangerous and having the power to emasculate like white men. Okay, so Cousin Vit is neither of these things, right? She is like a real person, and this is something Brooks is very concerned with, is like the depiction of the real lives of real African Americans in Chicago, which you'll see in the Bean Eaters too. Like, these are just two ordinary Americans who don't have a lot of money, who've kind of lived most of their lives. So Cousin Vit is like a real woman. She resists this kind of like fragmentation or this kind of reduction to stereotype that so many women in literature experience, didn't really experience, but so many women in literature were portrayed as, I guess. So she must emerge. I think we could describe her as powerful, right? She doesn't seem to care too much what other people think of her. And the most important word in this poem, I think, is in the end. She comes haply, which means by chance. On the verge of happiness, happily hysterics is. So Cousin Vit just is, like, she is just a person who can be and be herself. And I think part of Brooks's point with this poem is that so many literary depictions of black women don't allow them to just be, don't allow them to just live their lives. So Cousin Vit is someone who is full of life and is not a stereotype, but is rather a woman, you know, who does what she wants. Okay. You know, this is honestly so long, it's going to take forever to upload anyway, so I guess I will we'll end this now, and next time I will do the Bean Eaters, and I think we read the last quatrain of the Ballad of Emmett Till too. And so I'm also going to post some discussion questions for Catherine Mansfield that we can get to, and I sent you guys an email about like the exam and the final PLP, which we are not doing. So sorry, but I can't. So if you have any questions, comments, concerns, as always, you can email me. I hope this was helpful, and I hope you guys are all doing well and staying safe. Bye.